"You're my father," the 10-year-old girl whispered to the Arab billionaire. He laughed in her face until the DNA test came back 99.99% match. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. The gulf stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Zenith Bio's 37th floor executive lab, a perfect blue mirror reflecting a sky that looked painted on. Two Bell 429 helicopters sat on the private helipad, their rotors still, their million-dollar frames gleaming in the afternoon sun like jewelry someone forgot to put away. Inside, the air conditioning hummed at a temperature calibrated to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, not 67, not 69, but exactly 68, because Faris Al-Naim, 58, preferred precision in all things. The marble beneath his custom Italian loafers had been quarried from the same Carrara vein that supplied the Vatican. Each slab cost more than a luxury sedan. The engineered teak conference chairs, designed by a Danish architect whose furniture appeared in museums, ran $47,000 apiece. 12 of them surrounded a table made from a single piece of sustainably harvested Brazilian walnut. The room smelled like success, imported leather, fresh coffee from beans that sold for $600 per pound, and the faint ozone scent of electronics processing more data per second than most countries' entire digital infrastructure. Faris had built Zenith Bio from a single rented laboratory into a pharmaceutical empire worth $8.4 billion. He'd poured $3.2 billion of his personal capital into one program, one audacious bet that would either revolutionize pediatric medicine or destroy everything he'd spent 30 years building. An mRNA adjunct gene therapy designed to neutralize a lethal immune disorder that killed children before their 10th birthday. The therapy was brilliant, elegant, precise. It had sailed through Phase 1 trials. Phase 2 results had made headlines across 3 continents. A $1 billion partnership with a European pharmaceutical giant was 72 hours from final regulatory approval. Then the impossible happened, and a second dose, administered to a small cohort of 23 children, triggered a catastrophic immune cascade in 6 of them. Their bodies attacked themselves with a ferocity that terrified even the most experienced immunologists on Faris's team. Within 48 hours, 4 children were in intensive care. The regulatory board had frozen all trials. The European partnership sent a terse email: "Resolve or we walk." The stock price dropped 17% in a single trading day, vaporizing $1.4 billion in market value before lunch. But it was the phone call from Dr. Rahman, the lead pediatrician overseeing the trial, that made Faris's hands shake for the first time in 20 years. "We don't know why it's happening," Dr. Rahman had said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "We've run every test. The children who are reacting don't share obvious genetic markers. Their demographics are scattered. There's no pattern we can find." No pattern. The words haunted Faris like a diagnosis he couldn't cure. Now, 52 hours into the 72-hour deadline, the most expensive minds in pharmaceutical research sat around his Brazilian walnut table, looking like men who'd been told the laws of physics no longer applied. Dr. Henrik Johansson, Nobel laureate in immunology 2019, consulted for Zenith Bio at $15,000 per hour. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, whose work on gene expression had revolutionized cancer treatment, commanded similar rates. They'd been joined by an FDA advisory panel, 3 senior reviewers whose collective experience exceeded 90 years, and Zenith Bio's own 12-person immunology unit, each member holding advanced degrees from institutions that accepted fewer than 4% of applicants. Behind them, machines worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes processed data in silent judgment. A Titan Krios G4 cryo-electron microscope, $6.5 million, capable of imaging individual protein molecules. An Illumina NovaSec, $6,000, $985,000. Sequencing entire genomes in hours. Racks of servers processing petabytes of sequence data. Searching for the error that everyone knew existed but no one could find. The machines had found nothing. The brilliant minds had found nothing. The money, all that beautiful, powerful money, had bought exactly nothing. "We've analyzed 847 variables," Dr. Johansson said, his Swedish accent thickened by exhaustion. He'd been awake for 31 hours straight. His shirt, custom tailored in London, was wrinkled for the first time anyone in the room had ever witnessed. Cross-referenced against every known immunogenic pathway, the cascade doesn't follow conventional epitopy recognition patterns. It's as if the immune system is responding to something we can't detect. Unexplained immunogenicity, Dr. Okonkwo added, her usually commanding voice reduced to a defeated monotone. She'd built her reputation on explaining the unexplainable. Now she sat with her hands folded, staring at data that refused to make sense. The formulation is identical to what succeeded in Phase 1. Same manufacturing process, same quality controls, same everything. But in this cohort, in these specific patients, something triggers an autoimmune response we cannot predict or prevent. Ferris stood at the window, his back to the room, watching the sun descend toward the Gulf. He'd stopped listening to the technical explanations 6 hours ago. They all said the same thing in different academic language. We don't know, we can't fix it. Your life's work is about to collapse, and we can't stop it. Behind him, he heard Dr. Patel from the FDA clear his throat. Mr. Al-Naim, I need to be direct with you. Without understanding the mechanism, we cannot approve continued trials. The partnership... I know what the partnership requires, Ferris interrupted quietly. He didn't turn around. He couldn't let them see his face, couldn't let them witness the fear he'd spent decades learning to hide. How much time do we actually have? 20 hours, Dr. Patel said. Maybe less. The European board convenes at 8 a.m. Geneva time. If we don't have answers by then, 500 million euros in immediate exposure, Ferris finished. Minimum. Market confidence collapses. The stock enters free fall, and Zenith Bio becomes another cautionary tale about hubris and overreach. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of climate control and the quiet clicking of hard drives processing data that led nowhere. Outside, the city stretched toward the desert, millions of lives unfolding in buildings that looked like toys from this height. Down there, parents worried about ordinary things, school fees, traffic, what to cook for dinner. Up here in this temperature-controlled room with its Carrara marble and its defeated geniuses, Faris Al-Naim worried about children dying and a legacy crumbling and a problem that $3.2 billion couldn't solve. There was something else too, something private that Faris carried like a stone in his chest. Years ago, after a brief liaison he barely remembered, a medical conference in London, a night that blurred into morning, a woman whose last name he'd forgotten before the plane home, he'd made a decision, a vasectomy performed in a private Swiss clinic, ensuring that his empire would never be complicated by heirs or custody battles or the messy human chaos of family. He'd been 32, arrogant, certain that control over his biological legacy was just another variable to optimize. That certainty had hardened into identity. Faris Al-Naim had no children, would never have children, had made sure of it through medical intervention and careful choice. It was one of the few things in his life more solid than money, more permanent than success. He held that certainty now like a talisman against the chaos. At least this remained true. At least this part of his life was still under control. The irony that he'd soon learn how wrong certainty could be, how completely a 10-year-old girl with dirt on her face could shatter everything he believed about control and legacy and the price of being invisible, was still 37 floors and one chance encounter away. Dr. Johansson stood, gathering his tablet. I'm sorry, Faris, I truly am. But without new data, without some variable we haven't considered, I don't see a path forward. Faris finally turned from the window. His face showed nothing. He'd perfected that mask decades ago, but his eyes betrayed him. For just a moment, the assembled experts saw something they'd never seen in Faris Al-Naim before. Fear. Keep working, Faris said quietly. All of you. 20 hours is still 20 hours. Something we missed, something we overlooked. It has to be there. But no one in that room believed him. They'd already examined everything, used every tool, every algorithm, every advanced degree and hard-won insight. The answer, if it existed, wasn't going to come from inside these walls. It was going to come from outside, from below, from the invisible. Margins, where a girl who cleaned windows for 30 dirhams had taught herself to read genomic data on library computers with broken keyboards and laggy connections. The collision was coming, and when it arrived, it would shatter more than just a pharmaceutical crisis. It would shatter every assumption Faris al-Naim had ever made about worth, about intelligence, about whose knowledge mattered and whose didn't. But that was still hours away. For now, in the failing light of a deadline he couldn't buy his way past, Faris stood alone in a room full of expensive furniture and defeated experts, learning what powerlessness felt like for the first time in his carefully constructed life. The gulf kept stretching beyond the windows, perfect and indifferent. 20 hours remained. Layla was 10 years old, and she'd been invisible for exactly 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Not invisible in the fairy tale sense, no magic cloak, no special power, but invisible in the way that poverty makes children disappear from the sight of people who matter. She moved through the city like a shadow, noticed only when someone needed to shoo her away from expensive storefronts or complain about her presence near tourist areas. She'd lived in 7 different places since her mother died, a shelter that smelled like industrial disinfectant and desperation, a woman's guest room where she'd slept on a mattress on the floor for 4 months until the woman's boyfriend said she had to go, a youth hostel run by a charity that had 40 beds and 60 children competing for them every night. Currently, she stayed in the back room of a laundromat where the owner, Mr. Hassan, let her sleep if she folded towels until closing. The room had no window, just a flickering fluorescent light and the constant humid heat from the dryers. But it was dry. It was safe. It was hers until Mr. Hassan's brother needed the space or his generosity ran out, whichever came first. Survival had its own economy, and Layla had learned it quickly. Window washing paid 30 dirhams for an afternoon's work if you could reach the high corners without leaving streaks. She'd taught herself the technique by watching professional crews, mimicking their circular motions, their attention to edges. She traded fixed phone chargers, simple soldering work she'd learned from YouTube videos on library computers, for leftover sandwiches from the cafe workers who pitied her just enough to help, but not enough to ask questions. She collected discarded batteries from trash bins behind electronics shops, tested them with a meter she'd built from scrapped parts, and returned the functional ones for a few dirhams each. But her real education happened at night in the municipal library. The library stayed open until 10 p.m., and no one bothered a quiet child reading in the corner. The donated laptops were old, their processors slow enough that loading a single web page could take minutes, but they worked. Layla had discovered them 18 months ago while seeking warmth during a winter cold snap. She'd planned to just sit until closing, but then she'd seen a teenager watching a lecture video, and curiosity had pulled her over. The video was from an open university course on molecular biology. The teenager had fallen asleep halfway through, headphones still on, but Layla had watched the entire thing. Then she'd watched it again. By the 3rd night, she'd created her own account and started from the beginning. Fast Q headers, sequence alignment files, basic genomic notation. The language looked like gibberish at first, long strings of letters representing nucleotides, cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing. But Layla had time, endless empty hours between survival tasks, and she had something else. A mind that found patterns the way some people found faces in clouds. She taught herself to spot anomalies that graduate students paid stipends to miss. Irregular red depths, contamination signatures, quality score degradations that suggested equipment calibration issues. She couldn't afford courses or textbooks, but the internet offered fragments, research papers with technical details, forums where scientists argued about methodology, open access datasets that anyone could download. She learned because learning filled the hours, because it made her feel less invisible, because somewhere in those strings of nucleotides and probability calculations was a logic that made sense when nothing else in her life did. But there was another reason too, one she kept locked in the brass locket that hung around her neck on a frayed cord. Inside the locket, folded so small it had creased into nearly illegible fragments, was a piece of paper from a clinic. Her birth records, or what remained of them. The clinic had closed years ago, but her mother had kept this scrap, and Layla had kept it after her mother was gone. Most of it was standard information: birth weight, time, date. But one line stood out: a blood marker notation, rare HLA variant, B5701 subtype with unusual epitope binding, benign presentation, mother reports paternal European Arab heritage, specifics unknown. Specifics unknown. That phrase had haunted Layla for 3 years. The locket held 2 other fragments: a photograph, faded and water damaged, showing her mother standing beside a private jet's stairway. Her mother was young, maybe 24, wearing the kind of smile Layla barely remembered. The jet's tail number was partially visible, N7 something. The rest obscured by shadow, and written in her mother's handwriting on the back of her old notebook, one that had survived because Layla carried it everywhere, was a single line of initials: FAN Faris Al-Naim. Layla had tested the hypothesis 127 different ways: public records searches on library computers, cross-referencing flight registries with dates from her mother's old calendars, matching the partial tail number against private aviation databases. The probability calculations kept pointing toward the same conclusion: 89.3% likelihood that FAN referred to Faris Al-Naim, that the jet was registered to Zenith Bio, that her mother had been at a medical conference in London 11 years ago where Faris had been the keynote speaker. She wasn't looking for a fairy tale rescue. She wasn't imagining tearful reunions or wealthy father discovering long-lost daughter. Layla dealt in probabilities, not fantasies. What she wanted was certainty, proof, data that would confirm or deny the hypothesis that had been forming in her analytical mind. Her gift wasn't magic. It was pattern recognition refined by desperate necessity. Where others saw chaos, she found probable pathways. Where experts looked at complex systems and felt overwhelmed, Layla looked at complex systems and thought, what's the simplest explanation everyone's missing? She'd used that gift to survive, to know which cafes threw out sandwiches at which times, to predict which buildings would have unlocked service entrances on weekends, to understand the patrol patterns of security guards and the schedules of charity meal services. Now, unknowingly, she was about to use it to solve a $3.2 billion problem that had defeated Nobel laureates. The delivery truck arrived at Zenith Bio's service entrance at 5:47 a.m., carrying decommissioned compute nodes bound for recycling. Layla had been watching the building for 3 days, timing the deliveries, noting the gaps in security coverage, waiting for the right moment. The hypothesis demanded testing. The probability calculations suggested the evidence she needed might exist somewhere in this building's records: employment histories, conference attendance, archived research samples. She didn't have a plan beyond getting inside. She had a hypothesis and the desperate clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. She slipped between the pallets as workers unloaded them, her small frame hidden behind stacks of outdated hardware. The loading dock smelled like cardboard and machine oil. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing stayed controlled. Panic was a luxury. Fear was data. She noted the camera positions. The security guard's attention focused on his phone. The route toward the service hallway she'd identified from building schematics available on public permit databases. Inside, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. The hallway hummed with the sound of active servers and air handling systems calibrated to protect millions of dollars in equipment. Layla moved like she belonged there, like invisibility was a superpower she'd been born with rather than a survival skill learned through necessity. The service hall opened into a wider corridor. Diagnostic terminals lined the wall, displaying system statuses and network monitors. Layla paused at one, drawn by the heat map visualization spreading across the screen. Gene sequencing data, trial cohorts, statistical analyses, and there, in the error logs no one had thought to check, in the metadata everyone had labeled noise, batch processing notes, freezer alarm timestamps, handwritten technician observations. She saw it. The pattern. "Hey!" A security guard's voice cracked across the corridor. "You can't be here." Layla's fingers had already traced the anomaly on the screen. Lot B17. Freezer alarm at 2:37 a.m., 3 weeks before the catastrophic trial. Temperature fluctuation of 4.2 degrees for 16 minutes. Handwritten note in the maintenance log. Anti-A antibody response in prep batch. Nurse Yara flagged. Cross-referenced against patient demographics. 5 of the 6 children who'd reacted shared the same rare HLA haplotype, the same one noted in her brass locket. I said you need to leave. The guard was closer now, hand on his radio. Who's in charge of the gene therapy trial? Layla asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The guard blinked. What? The mRNA trial, the one that's failing? Who's running it? That's none of your... How do you know about that? I need to talk to whoever's in charge, Layla said. She pulled the brass locket from under her shirt, holding it up like a talisman. I can fix it. The guard laughed, but it was an uncertain sound. This wasn't a normal trespasser. This was a child in worn shoes and dirt-smudged clothes speaking about confidential research trials like she had clearance. Fix it, he repeated. You're like what, 12? 10, Layla corrected, and they filtered the wrong noise. 20 minutes later, Layla stood in the most expensive room she'd ever entered. The 37th floor executive lab felt like standing inside a museum. Everything precious and untouchable. Men in expensive suits turned to stare at her. She counted 15 people, 12 men, 3 women, all dressed like they'd never worried about money in their entire lives. The air smelled different up here. Clean, cold, certain. At the head of the Brazilian walnut table sat a man who could only be Faris Al-Naim. She recognized him from news articles, from the building directory, from the probability calculations that had led her here. He was 58, silver hair styled precisely, wearing a watch that could have fed every child in her shelter for a year. His eyes held the kind of sharp assessment that Layla recognized from people who made their living evaluating worth. Right now, those eyes were evaluating her and finding her lacking. Security brought you up here as a curiosity, Ferris said, his voice carrying the accent of expensive international schools and decades of commanding attention. They said you claim to have insights into our research trials. I assume this is some kind of confused attempt at, what, espionage? A scam? Layla's stomach growled audibly. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, a partial sandwich traded for a fixed iPad charger. Her face flushed, but she forced herself to meet Faris's gaze. You're using advanced algorithms to filter genomic data, she said, but you're throwing away metadata labeled as noise. Batch preparation notes, freezer temperature logs, nurse observations about antibody responses. That's where your answer is. The room erupted in condescending laughter. A man with gray hair and an accent Layla didn't recognize, Swedish maybe, shook his head. We've analyzed 847 variables across multiple analytical frameworks. The idea that handwritten notes from technicians would reveal what our systems missed is... Your systems missed it because you told them to, Layla interrupted. You trained your algorithms to ignore qualitative observations in favor of quantitative data. But the pattern only becomes visible when you integrate both. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, her expression shifting from amusement to cautious interest. What pattern? Layla took a breath. Lot B17 experienced a temperature fluctuation during preparation. 4 degrees for 16 minutes. That's within your acceptable variance, so the batch wasn't flagged, but that fluctuation altered the conformation of a specific stabilizer compound you're using. When that altered stabilizer combines with a rare HLA haplotype, B5701, with an unusual epitope binding variant, it creates molecular mimicry. The immune system mistakes the therapy for an endogenous antigen and triggers an autoimmune cascade. The laughter stopped. Ferris stood slowly. His expression had shifted into something unreadable. Where did a child learn to speak like that? Municipal library, Layla said simply. Open university courses, research papers. You'd be surprised what's available if you have time and internet access. And you expect us to believe? Ferris said, his voice taking on a theatrical quality that made Layla's skin prickle. That you, a girl who looks like she's been sleeping in alleys, has solved a problem that defeated 2 Nobel laureates and the best immunologists money can hire? The cruelty in his tone landed like a physical blow. Around the table, wealthy faces waited for her humiliation, this unexpected entertainment in their mourning of failure. But Layla had survived 3 years of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being told she didn't belong. This was just another version of the same lesson. "I can prove it," she said quietly. Forrest's eyes gleamed with something predatory. He was enjoying this, she realized, the drama, the spectacle of putting this presumptuous child in her place. "You know what?" Ferris said, his voice loud enough to fill the room. "I'll make you an offer. Fix our therapy trial. Find this pattern you claim exists, and if you're right, if you actually solve this problem, I'll give you $200 million. The room went silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. "But," Ferris continued, his smile sharp, "if you're wrong, if this is nonsense or guesswork or a lucky interpretation of something you overheard, you'll sign a public statement admitting you wasted our time. I'll make sure every news outlet in the region publishes your name and your failure. You'll be famous for being a fraud." He leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. The assembled experts shifted uncomfortably. This had gone beyond professional skepticism into something crueler. Layla looked at the man she suspected was her father, at the room full of people who'd never been hungry, never been invisible, never had to fix broken phone chargers to survive. She thought about her mother who died without ever telling her the truth, about the brass locket with its fragments of evidence, about 3 years of teaching herself genomics on laggy library computers because knowledge was the only thing no one could take away. She thought about the pattern she'd seen, about the probability calculations, about the certainty that came from data rather than hope. "Deal," Layla said. The word fell into the expensive silence like a stone into still water. Ferris's smile faltered for just a moment. He'd expected her to run, to cry, to back down when confronted with the stakes. But this child stood in her worn shoes and dirt-smudged clothes and accepted his terms with the calm certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. "Excellent," Ferris recovered, his theatrical mask sliding back into place. "Dr. Johansson, please provide our young consultant with access to the complete dataset. Let's see what brilliance she unveils." As the room began to move, Layla caught Forrest's eye one more time. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Just to him, not for the room." "What's that?" "You're my father," she said. Not a question, not a plea, just a hypothesis, stated plainly. FAN the jet. The conference in London, 11 years ago, my mother's name was Amara Hassan. Faris's face went completely still. For a heartbeat, the theatrical confidence cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Then he laughed, loud, sharp, cruel. "That," he said, "is impossible." But his hands, Layla noticed, had gripped the edge of the table, and his certainty, that private stone he'd been carrying, had just developed its first crack. Dr. Johansson led Layla to a workstation near the windows. The keyboard was pristine, the monitor curved and expensive. Everything smelled new, untouched by the kind of wear that came from actual need. "Here," he said, his tone hovering between professional courtesy and barely concealed skepticism. "This terminal has access to our complete research database, genomic sequences, trial protocols, quality control reports, statistical analyses, everything we've examined over the past 52 hours. Layla sat down. The chair adjusted automatically to her height, some kind of pressure sensor technology she'd only read about. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. "I need the raw data," she said. "Not the processed datasets, the original files." "That's what this is," Dr. Johansson replied. "Our algorithms have already—" "Your algorithms filtered out the noise," Layla interrupted. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes steady. "I need what you threw away, batch preparation logs, handwritten technician notes, freezer temperature records, equipment maintenance reports, the stuff your machine learning models were trained to ignore." Dr. Okonkwo stepped closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her skepticism. "Those aren't digitized in the primary database. They're considered supplementary documentation." "Where are they?" "Physical archives, 4th floor, but they're—" "I need them," Layla said firmly. "All of them. Every piece of paper related to Lot B-17 and the trial cohort that experienced adverse reactions. Faris watched from across the room, arms crossed. His theatrical smile had returned, but something else flickered beneath it. Unease, maybe, or the beginning of genuine curiosity. "Get her the files," he said, "all of them. Let's see what our prodigy does with notebook scribbles and freezer alarm logs." 30 minutes later, the conference table was covered in paper. Spiral-bound notebooks filled with technicians' observations, printed temperature logs showing freezer performance over 6 months, quality control checklists with handwritten notes in the margins, equipment calibration reports, even cafeteria receipts that marked which shifts had been working, which batches. Layla worked in silence. Her hands moved across the pages with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from years of sorting through trash bins for functional batteries, of finding patterns in discarded electronics, of building understanding from fragments. She pulled up the genomic data on the monitor, patient sequences, trial cohort demographics, HLA typing results. The screen filled with the kind of information that took most researchers years to interpret fluently. "There," she said, pointing to a sequence. "Patient 7, HLA-B57-YO1 with the epitope binding variant. Look at the antibody response timeline." Dr. Johansson leaned in. "That's within normal variance for... Now cross-reference it with this." Layla held up a handwritten note from a freezer maintenance log. "Temperature spike at 2:37 a.m., March 14th. 4.2 degrees Celsius for 16 minutes. The alarm was acknowledged, but the batch wasn't flagged because it stayed within acceptable parameters." "Acceptable parameters exist for a reason," Dr. Okonkwo said. "A brief temperature fluctuation wouldn't significantly impact..." "Not by itself," Layla agreed. "But look at what was being prepared during that window." She pulled up another file. "Lot B-17, your stabilizer compound, the polyethylene glycol derivative you're using to protect the mRNA payload during cellular uptake. At precisely 4 degrees above optimal storage temperature, its tertiary structure shifts slightly. Not enough to fail quality control, not enough to register as concerning, but enough." She stood, walked to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. Someone handed her a marker. Her hand moved quickly, sketching molecular structures with the confidence of someone who'd spent hundreds of hours visualizing these patterns. "Your stabilizer normally looks like this." She drew a complex shape. "But when exposed to that specific temperature variance for that specific duration, it refolds slightly. See this epitope here?" She circled a section. "In its altered conformation, it mimics an endogenous antigen. Not in everyone. Only in people with this specific HLA haplotype." She drew another structure beside it. "The immune system sees the altered stabilizer, recognizes it as similar to something the body produces naturally, and in patients with B57-SO01 variants, triggers an autoimmune response, like a bent key jamming a lock. The key still fits, but the shape is just wrong enough to cause catastrophic failure." The room had gone completely quiet. 15 of the world's most educated minds watched a 10-year-old girl in worn shoes explain molecular mimicry with a clarity that made the complex accessible. "It's elegant," Dr. Johansson whispered. "Horrifying, but elegant." "Can you prove it?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. Not condescending now, genuinely asking. "Run a simulation," Layla said. "Model the altered stabilizer conformation against the cohort's HLA typing. The correlation should be..." "I'll set it up." Dr. Okonkwo was already moving to another terminal. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up modeling software that cost more than most houses. "This will take approximately 20 minutes to process." Layla nodded. She walked back to the table covered in handwritten notes and sat down, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. She hadn't slept in 31 hours. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. Faris appeared beside her with a glass of water and a plate of food, small pastries, fruit, cheese. "Eat," he said. Not kindly, but not cruel either, just practical. Layla's hand trembled as she reached for a pastry. She'd learned not to eat too quickly, not to show too much hunger, but her body betrayed her. The first bite tasted like heaven, the second, like hope. By the third, tears were streaming down her face, silent and unstoppable. "When did you last eat?" Dr. Johansson asked gently. Yesterday, Layla said. Morning, a sandwich, half of one. The room absorbed this information in uncomfortable silence. These were people who had catered lunches brought to their offices, who ate at restaurants where the bill exceeded Layla's monthly survival budget, who'd never once wondered where their next meal would come from. The simulation is processing, Dr. Okonkwo announced, her voice tight with something that might have been shame. They waited. The servers hummed their calculations. The gulf stretched beyond the windows, indifferent to human drama. Layla ate slowly now, mechanically, her eyes fixed on the progress bar creeping across the monitor. At minute 14, the system crashed. The monitor went black. Error messages cascaded across backup screens. The primary server bank emitted a sharp warning beep that made everyone jump. What happened? Ferris demanded. Power fluctuation, a technician said, rushing to the server room. One of the processing nodes failed. We're losing the simulation data. Can you restart it? Not without reconfiguring the entire array. That's another 2 hours minimum, and we'll have to rebuild the model from... I can fix it, Layla said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She was already moving, walking toward the server room with her backpack, the worn canvas bag she'd been carrying when security found her. She reached inside and pulled out 2 pieces of soldered wire, a repaired surge adapter held together with electrical tape, and a small multimeter she'd built from salvaged components. You cannot be serious, Dr. Johansson said. That's a $400,000 processing array. You can't just... The power surge fried the input regulator, Layla said, already on her knees examining the connections. See? This capacitor is blown. The system can't route power properly to the secondary nodes. Her hands moved with the same practiced efficiency she'd shown with the research notes. This was familiar territory. This was survival work, fixing broken things with whatever materials were available, making do, adapting, solving problems that people with money would just replace. She bypassed the blown capacitor with her soldered wires, rerouted the power through her surge adapter, used the multimeter to verify the voltage stabilization. The entire fix took 4 minutes. The servers hummed back to life. The simulation resumed from its cached backup point. Layla stood up, wiping her hands on her worn jeans. Should be stable now. Your capacitor will need proper replacement, but this will hold until the simulation completes. Dr. Okonkwo was staring at her like she'd witnessed something impossible. Where did you learn to do that? Necessity, Layla said simply. I fix phone chargers for food. This is the same principle, just more expensive equipment. The simulation completed at minute 19. The results populated across the main monitor in clean, undeniable data visualization. The correlation between altered stabilizer conformation and adverse immune response was perfect. Not good, not promising, perfect. Patient 1, HLA B Fatis Vanor 01 variant, exposure to lot B17, adverse reaction. Patient 4, HLA B 5701 variant, exposure to lot B17, adverse reaction. Patient 7, HLA B 5701 variant, exposure to lot B17, adverse reaction. All 6 patients who'd experienced the catastrophic immune cascade shared the same genetic marker and had received therapy from the temperature-compromised batch. Patients without the HLA variant who'd received lot B17, no adverse reactions. Patients with the HLA variant who'd received different lots, no adverse reactions. The pattern was irrefutable. The solution, Layla said into the silence, is simple. Screen for the HLA variant before administering therapy. Replace your current stabilizer with an alternative that doesn't undergo conformational changes at elevated temperatures, and improve your temperature monitoring protocols to flag fluctuations before batches enter production. She pulled up a molecular structure on the screen. This alternative stabilizer has been used successfully in 3 other mRNA therapies. It's slightly more expensive, but it's thermostable across a wider range. No conformational changes, no molecular mimicry risk. Dr. Johansson sat down heavily, his hands were shaking. The adverse response rate with these modifications would drop to 0.3%, Dr. Okonkwo finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Within acceptable parameters for regulatory approval. Silence filled the room like a held breath. 15 experts who'd spent 52 hours chasing an answer had just watched a homeless 10-year-old girl solve their $3.2 billion problem in under 90 minutes. Dr. Johansson stood slowly. He walked to where Layla stood, her hands still dirty from fixing the server, her clothes still worn and patched, her face still smudged with the grime of poverty. He extended his hand formally. "She saw what we could not," he said, his Swedish accent thick with emotion. "What we were too arrogant to see. The answer was in the margins, in the handwritten notes, in the data we'd labeled as noise." Layla shook his hand. Her grip was small but firm. Faris hadn't moved from his position by the windows. His face showed nothing, that perfect mask he'd spent decades perfecting, but his knuckles were white where his hands gripped the window frame. The room began to move. Dr. Okonkwo was already on the phone with the regulatory board. Technicians were implementing Layla's solutions, pulling new stabilizer specifications, updating screening protocols. The crisis that had paralyzed Zenith Bio for 52 hours was dissolving in real time, replaced by the efficient machinery of execution. Layla walked slowly toward Faris. The room's attention was elsewhere now, focused on saving the trial, salvaging the partnership, rescuing the $1 billion deal. She stopped beside him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his precisely styled hair, the expensive weave of his suit fabric. "You're my father," she said again. Quietly. "Not for the room, just for him." "I wasn't asking before. I was telling you. Because I needed you to know before I proved the therapy solution. I needed you to understand that I didn't do this for money or recognition or because I expected anything from you." Faris turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. "That's impossible," he said, but the certainty in his voice had cracked completely. "I had a vasectomy years ago. Medical records, clinical documentation. I can't have children." "When?" Layla asked. "What? When did you have the procedure? What year?" Faris's jaw tightened. "I don't see how that's—" "I'm 10 years old," Layla said. "Born November 3rd, my mother's name was Amara Hassan. She attended a medical genomics conference in London 11 years ago. She was a research assistant for a pharmaceutical company. Low level, not important enough for anyone to remember, but she met you there. One night. She told me before she died that she never expected anything, never wanted to complicate your life, but she wanted me to know the truth when I was old enough to understand it." She pulled the brass locket from under her shirt, opened it with fingers that barely shook. "FAN, your initials. Here, in her notebook. The partial jet tail number from this photograph. I cross-referenced it. N7489B, registered to Zenith Bio. It was at that London conference. And this." She held up the clinic card. "My blood work from birth. HLA B57 Duor 1 variant. The same variant that just solved your therapy crisis. It's rare, 0.8% of the population. Want to know what the probability is that I'd have it by random chance while also being the right age, having a mother who attended that specific conference, and carrying initials that match your name?" Faris took the locket from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, the same long fingers, the same narrow nail beds, and something in his face shifted. "I'll take a DNA test," he said quietly. "Right now. Clinical standards, witness documentation. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong," Layla said. "But yes, test it. I want certainty too." The medical laboratory on the 19th floor smelled like antiseptic and latex. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to anyone in this story, just the coincidence of a common surname, was Zenith Bio's chief clinical pathologist. She'd administered 10,000 medical procedures in her career, but this was the first time she'd been asked to perform a paternity test on a billionaire CEO and a homeless child in front of witnesses that included 2 Nobel laureates, an FDA advisory panel, and the bank of lawyers Faris had summoned within minutes of agreeing to the test. "Standard STR analysis," Dr. Chen explained, her voice professionally neutral. "We'll examine 15 short tandem repeat loci plus emelegenin for sex determination. Results are definitive at probability thresholds exceeding 99.99%. She turned to Layla. "I need a buccal swab. Open your mouth, please." Layla opened her mouth. The swab scraped against the inside of her cheek, collecting epithelial cells that contained every answer written in her DNA. Dr. Chen placed the swab in a sterile tube, labeled it with clinical precision, and set it aside. "Mr. Al-Naim," she said, "I'll need a sample from you as well. However, for chain of custody purposes and to prevent any allegation of sample tampering, I'd like to use an archived research sample if one exists." Ferris nodded slowly. "I have biological samples in storage from my early research career, frozen at -80 Celsius, properly preserved, predating any—" He paused, his throat working. "Predating any medical procedures I subsequently underwent. The samples were retrieved from a controlled storage facility 3 floors down, vials frozen for 30 years, each one labeled with identification codes and dates. Dr. Chen selected one, verified the documentation, and showed the chain of custody records to the assembled lawyers. This sample was collected June 14, 1995, she confirmed, properly preserved, suitable for analysis. The extraction process took 40 minutes. DNA isolated from both samples, amplified through polymerase chain reaction, fragments analyzed through capillary electrophoresis. The machinery hummed its clinical truth, translating human relationships into numerical probabilities. The room waited in silence. Ferris stood by the windows, always looking out at the gulf, as if distance could provide answers. Layla sat in a chair too large for her, her worn shoes not quite touching the ground, her backpack clutched in her lap like a security blanket. Dr. Johansson had brought her more food. She ate mechanically, her eyes never leaving the sequencing machine. At minute 38, Dr. Okonkwo sat down beside her. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "what you did today was extraordinary. You understand that, don't you?" Layla nodded but said nothing. "I want to offer you something," Dr. Okonkwo continued. "Regardless of the test results, a position in my research lab, not as some publicity stunt but genuine work, learning, access to resources. You have a mind that sees patterns others miss. That's rare, that's valuable." "Thank you," Layla whispered. The printer in the corner clicked to life. Dr. Chen retrieved the paper, her expression neutral and professional. She reviewed it once, twice. Then she looked up at Ferris with something that might have been sympathy. "The STR analysis is complete," she said. 15 out of 15 loci match between the two samples. She walked to the conference table, placed the paper where everyone could see it, numbers and graphs that translated lived experience into probability calculations. Probability of paternity, 99.997%, Dr. Chen read aloud, which under standard interpretation guidelines indicates a biological parent-child relationship is virtually certain. The words hung in the expensive air. Ferris's mask, the one he'd worn for 58 years through building an empire, through calculated decisions and strategic ruthlessness, finally shattered completely. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. "That's impossible," he said again, but this time the words held no conviction, just desperate disbelief crumbling against irrefutable data. Layla stood. She walked to the table, looked down at the paper that confirmed what she'd calculated from fragments and probability. The 3 clues had aligned perfectly. FAN, the jet tail number, the rare blood marker all converging on this moment. "Your vasectomy," she said quietly. "When did you have it done?" 7 years ago, Ferris managed. I believed. "I'm 10, Layla said. "I was born before you made that decision, before you closed that door." Ferris looked at her, really looked at her, and saw his own eyes looking back. The same dark brown, the same analytical intensity, the same narrow bridge of the nose. How had he not seen it before? How had he looked at this child and seen only poverty, only an interruption, only something to dismiss and humiliate? "Your mother," he said, his voice breaking. "Amara Hassan. I remember now. Not well, not enough, but I remember. The conference. One night, she was brilliant. She asked questions during my presentation that challenged my methodology. We talked for hours afterward, and then she went home," Layla finished. "Found out she was pregnant a month later. Never contacted you. She told me she didn't want to complicate your life. Didn't want me to be some obligation, some burden. She raised me alone, worked herself to death doing it. The room had gone silent again. The lawyers looked uncomfortable. The scientists looked stricken. Everyone was witnessing something too intimate for professional distance. Faris walked slowly to where Layla stood. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. Strangers would see it. Anyone paying attention would see it. "I offered you $200 million," he said, "as a joke, as theater, to humiliate you when you failed." "I know," Layla said. "The money is yours," Faris continued, "but I suspect you're not going to just take it and disappear." Layla's expression shifted into something sharp and analytical, the same expression Faris wore when negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals. "No," she said, "I'm not, because $200 million used to buy nice things doesn't change anything. It doesn't help the next child like me. It doesn't fix the systems that made me invisible." She pulled out the notebook she'd been carrying, her mother's notebook, filled with probability calculations and research notes and the plans she'd been building for 3 years. "I want the $200 million as an endowment," Layla said, "for a foundation, the Amara Hassan Foundation for Overlooked Intelligence. It will fund apprenticeship programs in 5 cities, create satellite laboratories in underserved communities, provide stipends for children teaching themselves advanced subjects on library computers because they can't afford proper education." She met Faris's eyes directly. "I want 10% of Zenith Bio's research data made available to independent public scientists. Open access, no paywalls. Because the answer to your crisis today was in handwritten notes that your expensive algorithms ignored. Knowledge shouldn't be locked behind institutional access." "And I want an oversight board," Layla continued, her voice gaining strength, "including community representatives. People who understand what it's like to be invisible. They'll help decide which programs get funded, which research gets. You prioritized, not me alone, not you alone. A system." Faris listened as his daughter, a truth still settling into his bones, outlined a vision that was more sophisticated than proposals from executives twice her age. "You're not asking for a rescue," he said slowly. "You're negotiating a structural change." "My mother taught me that being smart isn't enough," Layla said. "You have to use it for something that matters. This matters." Faris stood. He walked to his lawyers, spoke quietly for several minutes. Documents were pulled up on tablets. Legal language was drafted with the efficiency that came from billing $1,500 per hour. He returned to Layla with a tablet showing a contract. $200 million endowment for the foundation, exactly as you specified. Open access to 10% of our research data with appropriate privacy protections for patient information. An oversight board with community representation, independent governance structure, and binding transparency requirements. He paused. "And one addition. I'm personally matching the $200 million or $400 million total." Layla's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because today you taught me something I'd forgotten," Faris said, "that intelligence exists everywhere, that the most important insights often come from the margins, that I've been measuring worth with the wrong metrics for my entire career." His voice dropped. "And because I have 10 years of being your father to make up for. This is just the beginning." He extended his hand. Not to a child, not to a charity case, but to an equal partner in something larger than either of them. Layla shook his hand. The deal was sealed. Dr. Okonkwo wiped her eyes. Dr. Johansson smiled for the first time in 3 days. Even the lawyers looked moved, though they'd never admit it. "There's one more thing," Layla said quietly, just to Faris. "I don't expect you to suddenly become a father. I don't need that. I've survived this long without one. But I would like..." She paused, vulnerability cracking through her analytical armor. "I would like to not be invisible anymore," she whispered. "I would like to be seen." Faris pulled her into a hug. Awkward at first. He'd never been good at physical affection, had built a life avoiding it, but then he held her tighter. This child who'd saved his life's work and shattered his certainties and showed him what really mattered. "I see you," he said. "I promise I see you." And for the first time in 3 years, 4 months and 11 days, Layla believed someone finally did. 5 years changed everything. The Zenith Bio Auditorium on a Tuesday morning in October looked nothing like the sterile executive lab where this story began. Floor-to-ceiling windows still framed the Gulf, but the room now held 300 seats filled with people who'd never expected invitations to spaces like this. Community leaders from underserved neighborhoods, public school teachers, social workers, librarians, scientists who'd taught themselves genomics on outdated equipment, and children, dozens of children, wearing clothes that actually fit, faces clean and healthy, eyes bright with the kind of hope that comes from being seen. At the podium stood Layla Hassan Al-Naim, 15 years old. Her voice had deepened slightly, her frame had grown taller, but those same dark analytical eyes remained unchanged. She wore simple professional clothes, nothing designer, nothing excessive, and the brass locket still hung around her neck, visible above her collar, a deliberate choice. 5 years ago, Layla began, her voice steady and clear, I walked into this building through a service entrance because I believed front doors weren't meant for people like me. I fixed broken electronics for food, I taught myself science in a library after everyone else went home, and I thought intelligence was something you either had access to or you didn't. She paused, letting her words settle across the audience. I was wrong. Intelligence isn't scarce. Access is scarce. Recognition is scarce. The belief that someone like me could contribute something valuable, that was what didn't exist. Behind her, a screen lit up with statistics that told a different story than the one that had started 5 years ago. The Amara Hassan Foundation has trained 2,047 apprentices across 3 countries, Layla continued. We've opened 7 satellite laboratories in communities where advanced scientific education previously didn't exist. Our apprentices, young people who were washing windows, fixing phones, surviving however they could, have jointly filed 12 patents with Zenith Bio. Innovations in drug delivery systems, improvements in cold chain storage, solutions to problems that expensive consultants missed because they weren't looking at the margins. The screen shifted to show faces, real children with real names. Kareem, 14, from Cairo. He taught himself electrical engineering by repairing discarded appliances. Now he's developing low-cost diagnostic equipment for rural clinics. His invention reduced equipment costs by 73% while maintaining accuracy standards. Another face appeared. Yuki, 13, from Manila. She learned chemistry from library books and YouTube videos while working in her family's street food stall. She identified a contamination pattern in local water supplies that health officials had missed for 8 years. Her analysis led to infrastructure changes that reduced waterborne illness by 31% in her community. Face after face, story after story, each one a testament to intelligence that had always existed, waiting only for someone to notice. In our pilot regions, hospital readmissions among marginalized pediatric patients dropped 18% after we implemented data literacy programs and pre-screening protocols developed by apprentices who understood what it meant to navigate broken systems. Not because we brought in expensive experts, because we asked the people living in those communities what they already knew. Layla's eyes found Ferris in the front row. He sat beside Dr. Okonkwo and Dr. Johansson. The 3 of them transformed in ways that went beyond professional achievement. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, Layla said quietly. The real transformation happened in how we define worth, how we recognize intelligence, how we decide whose knowledge matters. She clicked to a new image, the old executive lab, the one where she'd first drawn molecular structures on a whiteboard while wearing shoes held together with duct tape. Beside it, a current photo of that same room, now converted into an open workspace where apprentices sat at servers, learning, creating, solving problems that traditional hierarchies would never have trusted them to touch. 5 years ago, handwritten notes from technicians were labeled as noise and filtered out of important analyses. Now, Zenith Bio has restructured its entire research methodology to integrate qualitative observations with quantitative data. 3 major breakthroughs in the last 2 years came directly from insights that would have been discarded under the old system. The screen showed the brass locket, her brass locket, photographed and digitized as part of the Foundation's permanent archive. The 3 fragments that had led her to this moment, FAN, the partial jet number, the blood marker notation. Beside them, documentation of how those clues had been systematically investigated using the same pattern recognition skills she now taught to hundreds of children. My mother, Amara Hassan, worked 3 jobs and died at 32 from exhaustion and preventable illness, Layla said, her voice thickening with emotion she no longer tried to hide. She never got to see any of this, never got to know that the survival skills she taught me, finding patterns, making do with fragments, seeing value where others saw waste, would become the foundation for helping thousands of other overlooked children. She paused, collecting herself. But she knew something important. She knew that one person seeing potential could change everything. She saw it in me when I was learning to read genomic sequences on laggy library computers, and 5 years ago, despite every reason not to, despite the humiliation and the mockery, someone else finally saw it too. Ferris stood slowly, not planned, not scripted, but he couldn't stay seated. I was proven wrong in the best possible way, he said, his voice carrying across the auditorium. 5 years ago, I measured success by profit margins and quarterly returns. I judged worth by appearance and credentials. I built walls around knowledge and convinced myself that exclusivity equaled excellence. He looked at Layla with unconcealed pride. My daughter taught me that I'd been an arrogant fool, that the most important insights often come from people I'd trained myself not to see, that a 10-year-old girl in worn shoes could solve a $3.2 billion problem because she understood something fundamental. Patterns exist everywhere, but you have to be willing to look in unexpected places. The audience erupted in applause, not polite professional acknowledgement, but genuine celebration. Teachers who'd fought to get their students access to programs, social workers who'd advocated for children everyone else had written off, librarians who'd kept doors open late so children like Layla could learn. When the applause settled, Dr. Okonkwo stood. I spent 30 years in research before meeting Layla, she said. I have a Nobel Prize, I've published 147 papers, I've trained hundreds of graduate students, and in one 90-minute demonstration, a homeless child showed me that I'd been practicing science incorrectly. She smiled, genuine and warm. She taught me to read the margins, to value handwritten notes, to understand that the people we'd been excluding from laboratories weren't lacking in intelligence, they were lacking in opportunity. The foundation has transformed not just individual lives, but how we practice science itself, and that transformation is worth more than any prize I've ever received. Layla stepped back to the podium. The screen behind her showed a time-lapse of the last 5 years, satellite labs opening in neighborhoods that had never seen advanced research facilities, children in makeshift classrooms learning molecular biology, apprentices presenting at scientific conferences, patents filed by teenagers who'd taught themselves engineering while working survival jobs. This isn't charity, Layla said firmly. This is investment. Investment in intelligence that already exists. Investment in solutions we desperately need. Investment in the understanding that genius doesn't require wealth or credentials or institutional access. It just requires someone willing to look. She clicked to the final image. A group photo of the current apprentice cohort, 312 young people from 23 countries, standing in front of servers and lab equipment that they now knew how to use, wearing expressions of fierce determination mixed with joy. In the front row, Layla pointed, that's Maya. She learned chemical engineering while working in a textile factory. Her innovation in dye processing reduced toxic waste by 64%. Next to her, Ahmed. He taught himself coding while repairing phones in a street market. His algorithm improved disease outbreak prediction models that public health officials had been using for 20 years. Name after name, story after story, intelligence that had always existed, finally given tools and recognition and the simple dignity of being taken seriously. My mother gave me life twice, Layla said, her voice breaking slightly. Once when she bore me, and once when she died believing I could build something better than the circumstances she'd survived. This foundation, these apprentices, these breakthroughs, this is her legacy as much as mine. She touched the brass locket. And to everyone who said a child couldn't solve expert problems, who laughed, when I claimed to understand molecular mimicry, who measured my worth by my worn shoes instead of my mind? Thank you. Because proving you wrong became the foundation for proving thousands of other overlooked children right. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. Ferris stood beside his daughter, his hand on her shoulder, his face showing something he'd spent 58 years avoiding: vulnerability mixed with pride, accountability mixed with hope. After the presentation, after the crowds dispersed and the auditorium emptied, Layla and Ferris stood alone by the windows overlooking the Gulf. "I lost something 5 years ago," Ferris said quietly. "I lost the comfortable certainty that money solved everything, that credentials equaled intelligence, that I understood how the world worked. It was terrifying to have that certainty destroyed." "But you gained something," Layla replied. "Accountability," Ferris agreed. "The understanding that my choices matter, that exclusion has consequences, that the systems I built were actively hiding intelligence I desperately needed." He smiled. "I gained a daughter. I gained purpose. I gained the knowledge that being proven wrong can be the best thing that ever happens to you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city stretch toward the desert, millions of lives unfolding in buildings below. Somewhere in those buildings, another overlooked child was teaching themselves advanced subjects on borrowed computers. Another brilliant mind was surviving through pattern recognition and desperate necessity. Another genius was waiting to be seen. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked through that service entrance?" Layla asked. "Every day," Ferris said. "And then I work harder to make sure the next child doesn't have to sneak in. That door's open instead of close. That intelligence gets recognized instead of filtered out as noise." He looked at his daughter, really looked at her the way he'd failed to do 5 years ago when she'd first stood in his executive lab with dirt on her face and knowledge in her mind. "You saved my life's work," he said, "but more importantly, you saved me. From becoming someone I would have eventually hated. From measuring worth in dollars and credentials instead of insight and character. From missing the most important thing I'd ever find." "What's that?" Layla asked. "You," Ferris said simply. "I almost missed you completely. Almost humiliated and dismissed the single most important person in my life because I couldn't see past my own arrogance. I will never forget that lesson. Never stop being grateful that you gave me a second chance." Layla leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Father and daughter, 5 years into learning what that meant, still discovering each other, still building something neither of them had expected but both of them needed. Outside, the gulf stretched toward the horizon. Inside, the future they were building, together stretched even further. The payback was never about revenge. Layla Hassan al-Naim didn't save her father's company to punish him for his mockery. She didn't build a foundation to prove wealthy people wrong. She didn't spend 5 years transforming how science recognized intelligence just to settle a score. The payback was recognition, simple, powerful, transformative recognition that intelligence exists everywhere, in library corners and laundromat back rooms and service entrances and street markets and every overlooked margin where brilliant minds learn to survive through pattern recognition and desperate innovation. Recognition that a 10-year-old girl washing windows for 30 dirhams might understand genomic sequences better than Nobel laureates, because necessity taught her to see patterns that comfort allows people to miss. Recognition that handwritten notes from night shift technicians might contain insights that million-dollar algorithms filter out as noise. Recognition that the next breakthrough in medicine or engineering or any field you can name might be sitting in a municipal library right now, teaching themselves advanced subjects on a computer with a broken keyboard, waiting for someone to finally see them. Layla didn't just ask a question that day in the executive lab. She didn't just whisper, "You're my father," and shatter Faris al-Naim's comfortable certainties. She turned that moment of collision between wealth and poverty, credentials and self-taught knowledge, visibility and invisibility into a demand for systemic change. Not charity, not rescue, but fundamental transformation in how we define intelligence, how we distribute opportunity, how we decide whose knowledge matters and whose gets discarded as background noise. The Amara Hassan Foundation exists because one woman worked herself to death believing her children deserved better. And one man finally learned to see past his assumptions long enough to recognize genius standing directly in front of him. 2,547 apprentices exist because Layla refused to accept that intelligence required institutional access or wealthy parents or the right zip code. 12 patents, 7 satellite laboratories, 18% reduction in preventable illness. These numbers exist because someone finally started looking at the margins instead of just the center, started valuing handwritten observations alongside algorithmic analysis, started opening doors instead of slamming them on children who didn't look like they belonged. But here's the truth that should make every person watching this uncomfortable. Layla almost didn't make it through those doors. She almost turned around when the guard first spotted her, almost ran away when Ferris laughed in her face, almost accepted that people like her weren't meant for buildings like that, problems like that, recognition like that. The only reason we know her name, the only reason 2,047 other overlooked children got opportunities they'd been systematically denied is because she took one more step when everything told her to retreat. Because she had just enough evidence, 3 fragments of a probability calculation, to believe her hypothesis might be true, and because despite every incentive to dismiss her, despite the theater of humiliation, despite the comfortable certainty that homeless children don't solve expert problems, Faris al-Naim finally looked. He looked and he saw, and he had the humility to admit he'd been wrong. That combination, Layla's courage and Ferris's eventual willingness to recognize what he'd almost missed, changed everything. But right now, in your community, there's another Layla. Right now, somewhere close to where you're watching this, there's a child teaching themselves advanced subjects on borrowed equipment, and there's a brilliant mind solving problems no one asked them to solve. There's someone carrying knowledge the world refuses to see because they're wearing the wrong clothes, living in the wrong neighborhood, accessing education through the cracks instead of through the front door. They're fixing broken electronics to survive while understanding engineering principles that could revolutionize industries. They're memorizing chemical formulas while working survival jobs that people with credentials wouldn't touch. They're seeing patterns in data that expensive consultants miss because they're trained by necessity to notice what others overlook. And they're invisible, just like Layla was invisible for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. The question isn't whether they exist. They exist. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. In every city, every community, every margin where poverty and brilliance collide in uncomfortable ways that make comfortable people look away. The question is whether you'll see them, whether you'll be the teacher who keeps the library open late, the employer who interviews the candidate with the unconventional background, the scientist who reads the handwritten notes instead of filtering them out as noise, the person who looks past assumptions long enough to recognize genius that doesn't announce itself with credentials and expensive clothes. Share this story, not because it's inspirational or heartwarming or makes you feel good, but because it's a challenge, a demand that you examine your own assumptions about who deserves recognition, whose knowledge matters, whose intelligence counts. Look differently at the overlooked people around you, the custodians cleaning your office who might understand systems better than management, the street vendors who've optimized supply chains through survival, the children in underfunded schools teaching themselves advanced subjects because no one else will. Demand that systems open doors instead of slamming them. Demand that hiring processes look beyond credentials to actual ability. Demand that educational institutions value self-taught knowledge alongside formal degrees. Demand that recognition becomes about insight rather than pedigree, because the next breakthrough in medicine might be wearing worn shoes right now, carrying a backpack full of soldered wires and probability calculations. The next solution to your company's impossible problem might be sitting in a library after hours, learning on outdated equipment because it's the only access they have. The next genius who could change your field, your industry, your world, might be invisible right now, waiting for someone to finally see them the way Faris finally saw Layla. Not as charity cases, not as feel-good diversity initiatives, but as the brilliant, capable, essential minds they actually are? Layla changed science because one person looked past his assumptions long enough to see her potential, but she almost didn't get that chance. Almost got dismissed before she could demonstrate what she knew, almost became another invisible genius whose intelligence died with them because no one bothered to look. How many Laylas have we already lost? How many brilliant minds gave up before someone saw them? How many solutions to problems we desperately need are sitting in overlooked children right now, waiting for recognition that will never come? Don't let the next one be lost because you didn't look, because you measured worth by appearance instead of insight, because you filtered out the margins as noise instead of recognizing them as signal. The payback isn't revenge, it's recognition, and the person waiting to be recognized might be right in front of you if you're willing to see them.